The factory floor was a world of heat, noise, and motion. Sparks leapt like fireflies from the tips of torches, lighting up faces smudged with soot and sweat. Steel plates clanged and hissed as they were lowered into place, the air thick with the scent of molten metal. This was Detroit in 1943, where America's war effort pulsed through steel veins and beating hammers. Among the hundreds of men and women laboring under the roar of machines stood a welder named Thomas Keller. Tom wasn't anyone's idea of a hero. He was 42 years old, with a thick beard flecked in gray and hands scarred from decades of labor. Before the war, he'd welded bridges and locomotives, content to build things that stood still. But when his only son enlisted in the army, Tom traded the quiet rhythm of civilian contracts for the furious tempo of war production. He'd told himself it was his way of fighting, each weld a bullet, each seam a shield. The assembly line stretched endlessly before him, Sherman tank hulls, massive, raw, half-born creatures of iron. He watched them come together, piece by piece, until they resembled the beasts that would soon rumble across Europe. The tanks were built fast, sometimes too fast. Quantity wins wars, the foreman would bark. We don't have time to polish perfection. But Tom believed that steel remembered its maker. A sloppy weld could mean a seam that cracked under pressure, a turret that split when it took a shell. And a bad weld didn't just waste metal, it killed men. He'd seen photos, tanks ripped open like tin cans, crews charred inside. Somewhere in the ashes of those wrecks, he thought, was the ghost of a careless joint, a hurried hand. So when others took shortcuts, Tom didn't. He ground his seams twice, checked the metal for stress, ran his gloved fingers across the cooling lines to feel for imperfections. His welds weren't pretty, they rippled unevenly like scar tissue, but they held. The foreman called them ugly, but no one could say they broke. One night, after his shift, he sat alone in the break room, reading a letter from his son. "We got the new Shermans," the letter said. "They say they come straight from your city, maybe even your shop. Feels good to think you had a hand in what's keeping me alive." Tom folded the paper slowly, his eyes lingering on those last words. He returned to the floor with a fire in his chest. The weeks rolled into months. The plant never slept. Day shifts bled into nights, the same thunder of presses and hiss of torches echoing through the cavernous hall. Tom grew leaner, quieter, his focus sharpening to a blade. Then came the inspection. A team from Washington was visiting, engineers and officers in crisp uniforms who wanted to speed up production. They moved along the line, examining welds with flashlights, marking flaws with chalk. When they reached Tom's section, one of the engineers frowned. "These seams look rough," he said, tapping a weld with his pen. "You're overheating your passes. We need uniformity, not ridges." Tom wiped his brow, eyes steady. "They hold," he said simply. The engineer sighed. "They don't look like regulation. Fix them." Tom clenched his jaw but nodded. After the man left, his foreman approached, shaking his head. "Tom, just smooth it out a bit. We need to get these hulls shipped." But Tom couldn't do it. He knew his technique looked messy, but that ripple, those layers, were deliberate. Each one melted slightly into the next, reinforcing the joint against shock. A pretty weld was fine for a car or a boiler. But for a tank, pretty didn't stop a shell. He kept welding the same way, night after night, while the inspectors moved on to other plants. His section kept turning out tanks, and no one said much more. Eventually, his name was forgotten. Among the thousands of workers who passed through the line, the war raged on. Somewhere in Normandy, his son's unit rolled forward in a column of Shermans. The men called their tank, "Lucky Lady." They'd been through hell, machine gun fire, mines, artillery, and yet the tank still ran. They joked that it was made of magic steel. One afternoon, as they pushed through a small French village, they came under ambush. A German 88mm gun fired from a hidden hedgerow. The shell struck the Sherman dead center on its flank. The impact rocked the crew, knocking them against the walls, but the armor didn't breach. The weld along the side seam held, flexing but not splitting. The gun fired again. Another hit, another blast, another flash of flame. Smoke filled the turret, the men coughing, panicked, but still alive. The third shell struck the same line. It gouged deep but didn't tear through. When the gun finally fell silent, knocked out by Allied artillery, the tank limped back to friendly lines. Mechanics examined the damage later. 3 direct hits, all on the same seam. The paint was scorched, the metal warped, but the weld had refused to give. The crew lived. Weeks later, Tom received another letter. It was shorter than the last, written in a shaking hand. "Dad, I don't know if it was yours, but one of our welds took 3 hits today and didn't break. I think you saved us. Whatever you're doing, don't stop." He read it again and again, every night after work, the paper softening with sweat and fingerprints. He never told anyone. He just kept welding. As the war drew toward its bloody end, the plant slowed, then stopped. The contracts ended, the workers dispersed, the machines fell silent. Tom packed up his tools and walked home, unsure what to do with himself. The war had taken his strength and given him silence in return. His son made it back in one piece, thin, limping, eyes too old for his face. They didn't talk much about the war, but one evening, as they sat in the yard watching the sun sink over the city, his son pulled a photograph from his pocket. It showed the lucky lady, scarred, dented, its paint blackened from fire. Along one flank was a jagged line of metal, ugly and proud. "This saved us," his son said softly. "They said the weld was unbreakable. I like to think that's your handiwork." Tom smiled faintly, his eyes misting. He didn't say anything, just stared at that weld, the ripples and ridges so familiar. Years passed. The war became memory. The factories changed hands, then closed. Tom grew old, his hands too shaky for fine work, his lungs weakened from years of smoke. When he died, few people remembered the welder from Detroit who'd argued with inspectors. His name was never written in any report, his contribution never recorded in any official archive. But out in the fields of Normandy, a museum stood on the site of the old battlefield. Among its exhibits was a Sherman hull, preserved exactly as it had been found. On its flank, visitors could still see the seam that had refused to die. The curator called it the miracle weld. It was lumpy, uneven, distinctly hand-done, unlike the smooth machine seams of later models. Engineers who studied it marveled at its strength, its ability to absorb shock instead of crack. It was a textbook example of function over form. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "This weld line withstood 3 direct hits from an 88mm shell during combat in 1944. The crew of the Sherman survived. Welder unknown. But to one family, the welder wasn't unknown. To them, he had a name and a story. His grandson, decades later, would visit that museum, standing quietly before the tank. He'd trace the weld with his fingertips, feeling the ridges, the way the metal had flowed like frozen waves. He'd imagine the heat, the noise, the sweat that had shaped it. And he'd whisper, "You did good, Grandpa." The guide noticed him lingering and approached. "Beautiful piece of history," she said. "They think whoever welded it must have had unusual technique. It's not standard for the time. See the layering. That's what gave it flexibility." The young man smiled. "He used to call it ugly," he said. "But he always said ugly things last longer." The guide laughed, not understanding, and moved on. But the grandson stayed, lost in thought. He realized that his grandfather's legacy wasn't medals or fame. It was that quiet defiance, that stubborn insistence that doing something right mattered more than doing it fast or pretty. In the war's machinery of destruction, Tom Keller had created something that endured. Elsewhere, veterans told their own stories. Men who'd ridden in those Shermans swore some of them were blessed. They'd say, "You could tell when a tank was built by someone who cared. You could feel it." They didn't know the welder's name, but they knew his spirit. Every time their armor held, every time they made it home, they owed their lives to hands they'd never shake. In time, scholars studying wartime production would rediscover old blueprints and records. One historian, while researching a book on industrial craftsmanship, came across inspection notes from 1943. In them was a complaint about a welder named Keller, whose seams lacked uniform aesthetic quality. The note recommended additional supervision. The historian laughed aloud and bookmarked the page. When the book was published, she included a small anecdote about an anonymous welder whose ugly work saved lives. People loved the story. They said it captured something human about the war, a reminder that victory wasn't only born from generals and soldiers, but from ordinary hands doing extraordinary work. The tale spread across engineering forums, museum exhibits, documentaries. Iron and Fire. One film called it, showing close-ups of sparks flying and steel bending under invisible pressure. And though the film never named him, the voiceover echoed the truth Tom had lived by. Perfection isn't in how it looks, it's in whether it holds when everything else breaks. Back in Detroit, the old factory had been converted into loft apartments. One night, as construction crews stripped away the rusted beams, they found an old locker behind a wall. Inside was a toolbox covered in dust. The name stamped into the lid read T. Keller. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained rag, lay a single welding torch, its handle worn smooth, and a folded letter, brittle with age. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, if you're still building, make it strong. Someone's life depends on it. TK." The crew chief who found it donated it to the local historical society. They placed it in a small exhibit beside photos of Detroit's wartime industry. People walked past it every day without much notice, but some stopped to read the letter. A few even smiled, thinking of the lives tied invisibly to that simple promise. War had long ended, but the truth Tom lived by never did. Somewhere in every generation, someone builds something that keeps others alive. A bridge, a hospital, a weld on a machine. Their names fade, but their work endures. In that sense, Tom Keller never died. He lived on in the tanks that rolled through Europe, in the soldiers who returned home, in the steel that refused to shatter. He lived on in every craftsman who refuses to cut corners, in every worker who knows that strength isn't about appearance, it's about integrity, inside and out. Decades after his passing, his great-granddaughter became an engineer. On her first day at a manufacturing firm, she carried a small piece of metal in her pocket. A fragment cut from that museum's Sherman, a gift from her father. She kept it there like a talisman. Whenever she felt pressure to rush a project or compromise a standard, she'd run her fingers over its rough edge and remember the story. Iron and fire, she would whisper. Do it right, even if it looks ugly. And somewhere, if steel could remember, it would echo back the rhythm of his torch, the pulse of molten faith, and the quiet truth that saved 1,000 soldiers. One stubborn weld at a time.